Tonight we're going to be talking about what is creation science, and I think that needs to be done because it has been grossly misrepresented. I think one of the best places to start is with a statement by Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justice Scalia as they were considering the issue in the Edwards versus Aguillard case, the Balanced Treatment Act from Louisiana. This was an act that was ruled unconstitutional. Really, really bad things they wanted to do in Louisiana. They wanted to have balanced treatment on this issue. And they decided they didn't need that, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. But in the process, Rehnquist and Scalia says we have no basis on the record to conclude that creation science need be anything other than a collection of scientific data supporting the theory that life abruptly appeared on the earth. And I agree with them. That's what we're talking about, the scientific evidence. As illustrated on the slide, we're talking about what we can see and touch and taste, the empirical evidence. Well, now, how is that going to tell us whether things were created or just naturally occurred? Can you distinguish between natural origins and created intelligent design origins by looking at the physical? Well, let me illustrate. We look at this rock. Tell me about the origin. Did this happen naturally or did someone design it? Well, you've got a pretty good idea. This probably happens naturally. On the other hand, we see this rock, and I don't think that happened naturally. I think created design is the best explanation, and I think most would agree. But now then we have entered into the area that has to be relegated to the Sunday school classroom. You can't have that in the schoolroom. Does that make sense to you? You can, by looking at the empirical evidence, see whether this happened naturally or whether it was designed, and no, this is not necessarily religion at all. Another very obvious illustration, I believe, is seen when you walk down the beach and you see the lines, the lineations here that parallel the waves. Now, was this natural or was this designed? Well, you say that probably the waves did this. It parallels the waves. You can see them producing this kind of effect. Some order, yes, but probably still of natural origin. But you walk a little further and you see on the beach, John loves Mary. Waves probably did that, you think. But if you conclude that it must be intelligent design, now then you've got to be in the Sunday school classroom. You can't be in the schoolroom. I think that's just utter nonsense, but demonstrates that from the empirical evidence you can see clear indications to distinguish between the natural and the designed. And when we look at the universe around us, we see abundant evidence, I believe, of design, and that's going to be our theme actually throughout the week. But when we look, for example, at this bacterial flagellum, the little tail on the end of the bacteria that helps it propel, this is astounding. When Darwin looked at the, quote, simple cell, he saw what was called a black box. That's all he could tell. Well, as we learn more about it, it's like a city with factories and just mind-boggling complexity. This particular machine, and that's the only way to describe it, is an electrical motor. It has rotors, it has stators, it has O-rings, bushings and U-joints, it has drive shafts. all of this is coordinated in 30 functioning coordinated parts, such that if any one of the 30 parts is missing, it doesn't work. There's no way to get the first 5 and then work for a little while and then gradually get another one. If you're missing any of them, it stops. You've got to have all of them at once. And I don't think there's any way to explain that in terms of a gradual evolutionary process. And the design is absolutely astounding. It turns at up to 100,000 revolutions per minute and can reverse directions in a quarter turn. Our engineers today can't build that. We don't have anything that our engineers can design that works that efficiently or that works that well. Now, if you see intelligent design in John Loves Mary, what do you see when you see an electric motor with better design than anything we've been able to come up with? I don't think that's a hard question. In fact, evolutionists understand that. Richard Dawkins is one of the more prolific writers against creation for evolution in our time. He's from Oxford. And he reminds people in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, right at the beginning on page 1, that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed. That's the way he defines biology. Now, he doesn't believe it was designed, but it's an illusion. Yeah, it looks that way, and he admits it, but it's not so. Francis Crick, Nobel laureate, co-discoverer or describer of DNA, makes a similar statement when he says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, because obviously it looks that way and you've got to really work at this or you'll get the wrong idea, because you have to constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, and you've got to work at that, but rather evolve. He has faith, of course, in that. Well, I think maybe it's more reasonable to just believe that what it looks like is what it is. But I think it's their philosophy that drives them in the opposite direction in spite of how it looks. We need to understand that as we're talking about origins, there are 2 possibilities, and only 2, and that's important for several reasons. Notice the statement by Douglas Fatuma, again a very prolific writer against creation, but a well-known scientist. He says, creation and evolution between them exhaust the possible explanations for the origin of living things. Organisms either appeared on Earth fully developed, or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed from pre-existing species from some process of modifications, naturally or suddenly, not natural. And there are variations of each. But if we understand there are only 2, now sometimes we get the objection, well, you're only talking against evolution and no evidence for creation. And we're going to be dealing a lot with the evidence for evolution and showing that it's not valid this evening, but if you'll be here for the rest of the week, you'll see that charge is absolutely false. But if there's only A or B, and you show it's not A, you have given positive argument for the other, haven't you? But we're only allowed to have one of these views in the classroom. You can only teach evolution because, after all, that's science, and creation is religion, and never the twain shall meet. I think that's naive to the point of being absurd. Both evolution and creation can be investigated scientifically, and I believe we demonstrated that very simply and very easily, and it'll be more obvious as we proceed. And both evolution and creation have profound religious implications. You mean evolution has religious implications? Well, if you're not aware of that, you hadn't thought about it very much. Let's look at some of the statements by some of the leading evolutionists in the country, beginning with Edward Erickson, writing in The Humanist just a few years ago. He said the core of the humanistic philosophy is naturalism, and this naturalism is his religion. That's the proposition that the natural world proceeds according to its own dynamics without divine or supernatural control or guidance, and that we humans, beings, are creations of that process. obvious religious implications. Richard Lewontin makes the point even stronger. Again, one of the leading evolutionists in the country from Harvard. He says it's not the methods and institutions of science that somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Now, a lot of people think scientists wouldn't look at it that way. No, it's not science that says you have to look at it naturally. On the contrary, he says, we're forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation, a set of concepts that produce material explanations. We have made up our mind we're going to see it naturally. We adhere to that materialistic philosophy, and we're going to set up all of the investigations so that it produces that answer, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying. In other words, it may look crazy, but that's the way we're going to do it. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, this is the philosophy that dominates in science. And to say there's no religion here is just extremely naive. Notice the statement by Steven Pinker of MIT. He said, no evidence would be sufficient to create a change in mind. That it is not a commitment to the evidence. Can you believe this? This is a scientist speaking. We're not committed to evidence in terms of this issue of materialism as opposed to the divine. But it is a commitment to naturalism. That's the thing that controls. And nothing's going to change our mind. They've made up their mind, and that's where they are, because there are no alternatives, that is, except God, and they're not going there. We would almost have to accept natural selection as the explanation of life on the planet, even if there were no evidence for it. Because then you're faced with God, and they're not going to do it. They have committed themselves to naturalism. And so to say one is pure science and the other is religion is very naive and just not so. Isaac Asimov, perhaps the most prolific writer, written over 600 books, recently deceased, an atheist, nevertheless says, I have faith and believe myself. I believe nothing beyond those natural laws is needed. That's his faith. I have no evidence for this. It is simply what I have faith in and what I believe. So it's a blind faith. He has decided to be, in his religion, a naturalist, and he's committed to that. He believes that because he wants to believe that, not because of the evidence. And it's not because of science. It's because of a commitment to a religious philosophy. In fact, when you look at the philosophy of the unbeliever, they have to believe just all kinds of nonsense to be an unbeliever. Unbelievers are great believers. They have to believe that an explosion produced all of the order that we see in this universe. That takes a lot of faith. They believe that molecules somehow came into existence on their own and then bounce around for tens of billions of years and become living cells all by themselves. And they believe that. They believe that errors in the complex genetic system of that cell can produce greater complexity. I've not seen such faith in all Israel. It's just unbelievable what an unbeliever has to believe to be an unbeliever. But they say, we're going to be scientists and you're religious and you have one in the classroom and you can't have the other. And it's interestingly, late last year, a court decision rendered the conclusion that atheism is religion. And some folks up at the Wisconsin State Penitentiary got in trouble because they didn't honor the religion of one of their cellmates there, one of the people there in one of the inmates. Federal Court of Appeals ruled yesterday atheism is religion. And so people say that's not so. Well, you've got court decisions on the matter. Michael Roos is one of the leading philosophers in the country. I attended a debate where he was defending his position last week in Los Angeles. And he acknowledges evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. He says evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with its meaning and morality. Evolution is religion. So the leading philosopher of science in the country says this is religious. It's the alternative. And they're committed to it devoutly. But that's the religion that is established in our country. Now, our Constitution says you can't have a state religion established by the state, supported by the state. But we do, and it is the religion of naturalism that is defined by the courts as a religion that is promoted in our schools to the exclusion of all else, all other religions, as propaganda, and our tax dollars support it by the billions. One very obvious example, the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, according to the Chicago Tribune just last year, said the whole, and this is from the president, the core of the museum is evolution. And of course our tax dollars are supporting it. Recent years, it has dedicated a lot of resources to educate visitors about evolution. That includes spending $17 million in 2 years to recast its permanent exhibit on evolution. And we're paying for that. That's the establishment of religion in our country. Our schools pontificate humanistic naturalism without allowing any alternative or allowing anyone to point out the weaknesses, typically. For an example, Prentice Hall's biology textbook puts it this way, and this is a standard high school biology text. There's no doubt that if you jump up in the air, you'll end up on the ground. It makes no difference whether you understand or even believe in gravity. Just as definitely life on Earth evolved and is continuing to evolve all around us all the time. Supported by our tax dollars, just pontificating. This is the way it is. Yes, it is definitely religious, and we have the establishment of religion. But some would say, I understand the problem, but isn't it illegal to do anything else? And the answer is absolutely no, though the press would leave that impression, and they do regularly. And I can say that because I have Supreme Court authority to say that, again referring to the Edwards versus Aguillard case, this time the majority, written by Brennan, tells us this, the act, this terribly unjust act that says you ought to have balanced treatment of these issues. This act does not grant teachers a flexibility they did not already possess. In other words, you don't need this act. You already have this flexibility to supplant the present science curriculum with the presentation of theories besides evolution about the origin of life. You already have that right, he says. Teaching a variety of scientific theories about origins, and as we've documented, there's only two. But you can do that. It might be validly done with the clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science education. Now, you can't do it to promote belief in the Bible or a particular religion. But as science, you can validly teach a variety of origins, as we looked at the arrowhead as opposed to the natural rock. We look at varieties of explanations of origins, and yes, it is legal. In fact, when this act was overturned, many in the press said, well, they've outlawed creation science. They said that. They were lying, but they said it. Stephen Gould was interviewed about that time and asked this question. He's one of the more famous evolutionists of our time. And he said, no statute exists in any state to bar instruction in creation science. It could be taught before, it could be taught now, which is certainly the case. And most of the people in our country believe that we should look at all the scientific evidence, all the scientific alternatives. In Texas, just a few years ago, Zogby took a poll testing this concept. Under the proposition, teach only Darwin's theory of evolution, 16% agreed. And I don't believe it's that different across the country. regarding the proposition also, teach Darwin's theory, also teach the scientific evidence against it, 75% agreed. But the 16% dominate, and you can't do it in the classroom, or at least they don't do it. It's not in the textbooks. A more recent poll here by CBS Broadcasting was reported with the headlines, "Creationism Trumps Evolution." Now, to be fair, it should be "Creationism Trumps Evolutionism." They kind of prejudiced it with their wording. But testing the idea, or at least here leading the thought, Americans do not believe that humans evolved. The proposition was God created humans in present form. All Americans, 55% agreed. Humans evolved. God did not guide the process. 13% agreed. But the 13% prevail, and that's all that's taught in the classroom. In spite of this propaganda in the classroom, a great deal of progress is being made, and a number of prominent scientists with tremendous opposition and with great danger to their careers have taken a courageous stand. And this was in 2001 in New Republic, with the headlines, "100 scientists take a courageous stand." And these were scientists in major scientific institutions across the country, like the Smithsonian, the American Museum of Natural History, some of the leading universities. And they say, "We dissent from Darwinism. We don't believe Darwinism can explain what we see in this world." And 100 of them signed the proposition and put their name and their position there. And since then, the momentum has grown, and now over 700 have signed that proposition, all with doctorates in the natural sciences, including scientists from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, from the Russian, Polish, and Czech National Academies, from universities such as Yale and Princeton and Harvard and Stanford and MIT and Columbia and Purdue and Berkeley and UCLA and Duke and Cambridge and Oxford. Professors at these major institutions have said, "We don't agree that Darwinism explains origins." And if you're wondering about Texas institutions, yes, 25 from A&M, 16 from University of Texas, 5 from Texas Tech, are signatories to this particular proposition. And from my experience in speaking on those campuses, there are a whole lot more that believe that. They come up to me after I speak and say, "I agree with you, Dr. Patton, I can't let it be known, but keep up the good work." These are brave men, and I could tell all kinds of stories that would just give you shivers about some of the things they endured because of the stand. But in spite of this, leading scientists taking a stand against Darwinism, we have men like Ernst Mayr saying, "No educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we know to be a simple fact." And we know him to be a simple liar. He knows better. I know he knows better. But he says this anyway, in spite of the fact that there are many educated people, as we've demonstrated. Carl Sagan certainly knew better and acknowledged in his book, The Demon-Haunted World, only 9% of Americans accept that human beings, other species, have slowly evolved by natural processes. 13 to 9% is what the polls reflect, depending on who asked and how it's asked. But that's what dominates in the classroom, and I think that's a crying shame. And why is it that way? I get asked that all the time. And there's a simple answer to that. It's because you and I have allowed it to happen. And we need to think about that. We are making progress in spite of the great disadvantages that we have in the classroom. Debates across the country have been held, and while they have slowed down and virtually stopped, we are enjoying the evolutionists have given up because they're losing, and they've quit. I had a debate scheduled several months ago at LSU with the head of the geology department. It had been scheduled for about 6 months. I showed up, as did enough students to fill the auditorium, over 400 students, but the professor didn't show. And so I won. We spoke for about an hour, had another hour of Q&A. Some of them stayed till midnight. The organization that put it on did a survey when they first came in the door, gave out cards, and then collected them. 54% believed in creation when they arrived. That means, I think, creationists have a disproportionate number that want to know about the evidence and are interested in the facts. They did a follow-up 2 weeks later, and 91% of those then believed in creation. It didn't help him not to show up. Niles Eldridge talks about these debates, and he has debated a number of times. I debated him in Orlando, Florida. He is curator of the American Museum of Natural History, professor at Columbia. And he says, creationists today, at least the majority of their spokesmen, are highly educated, intelligent people. Skilled debaters, they have always done their homework, and they nearly always seem better informed than their opponents, who are reduced too often to a bewildered state of incoherence. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. He says creationists travel all over the United States, visiting college campuses, staging debates with biologists and geologists and anthropologists. The creationists nearly always win. And he's right. He was a pushover. He had so much in print that he was just in serious trouble when he started. When the press interviews evolutionists, they always have to interview Eugenia Scott, who is president of the National Center for Science Education. Sounds like a very prestigious organization. It's just it's a watchdog group that hates the creationists. It's one she formed by herself. And she says scientists should refuse formal debates because they do more harm than good. And they're doing that now. That's the standard procedure. And they do more harm than good for the evolutionist. I was recently up in New York. Some of you know Keith Sharp, and we were lecturing there near Syracuse University, and he was trying to get a debate going, and he challenged 100 geologists within a 100-mile area in my name to debate, and they all refused. And so with his advertisements on the back, he put, "Here are the geologists who refused to debate Dr. Patton." And it's not just me. I mean, they have refused to debate creationists around the world. However, she goes on to say, but scientists still need to counter the creation. In other words, let's talk about this, but make sure you do it when they're not there. Now, is that good science? I think it's just nonsense, and I think we ought to ridicule it and make fun of it. It's certainly very different from Darwin's view, who had a much more reasonable perspective in Origin of the Species. He says a fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. Does that make sense? That's what I believe. Of course, when you do that, the creationists nearly always win, as even the evolutionists acknowledge, and so they've stopped.